Hello everyone, I'm Gemma Beall. Welcome to Attaining the Second Cognition. My Identifying the Narcissist video raised some interesting perspectives regarding narcissists. One of our viewers said in a comment, "Curious to know how, from a second cognition perspective, one would differentiate the ego of the first cognition and the false self of the narcissism, which includes a spectrum not always qualifying for a psychiatric diagnosis of the disorder." See, in healing from narcissistic abuse, survivors are instructed, at least by those more knowledgeable, to develop their narcissism, the other end of the spectrum, with its bearing in true self-concept and self-love based on that authentic self-concept. Although I personally question whether someone needing to develop their narcissism, authentic self-love, should skip that process and jump into ego destruction for preparation into second cognition. Not rhetorical, and really interested in perspectives on this. So this presentation is called Healing from Emotional Trauma. For those of you that are new to our channel, this information will more than likely not make sense if you're not familiar with our work, so it might behoove you to check out our books and videos. In this presentation, I'm going to address the issue of self-love and emotional trauma with my perspective on it from spending years trying to find self-love and the years I took healing myself from my own emotional traumas. I'm 100% sure that I'm going to piss some people off with my perspective, but I ask you to please set it aside, observe, and listen. I'm not someone speaking about a topic that I don't know shit about. I have a very deep and intimate relationship with emotional trauma, and I have not only healed it, but have also removed the scarring associated with it. If you notice here, I say that I healed myself from my own emotional trauma. I did not say I healed myself from my own emotional trauma caused by fill in the blank. The reason I did not state a caused by is because once I was able to obtain emotional neutrality and remove my emotions from the equation and look at my experiences as an observer without emotions, I discovered that I was responsible for about 90% of my emotional trauma, not the borderline narcissist I had relationships with. When I looked at the other emotional traumas that I had also experienced, but not from a romantic relationship, I also realized that about 90% of those were caused by my own emotions. Emotions are the rule of the first cognition because emotions are the weapon that the Hapim virus chose to use to keep us under its control. Emotions, in and of themselves, are not necessarily a bad thing, but when they become the ruling force in one's life through being overreactive and reactionary, and they are for most people, it can end up in a disaster that can leave marks and leave very deep scars within the psyche and the cellular system of the form. Emotions cloud our judgment. Emotions overrule pragmatism. Emotions become the drug that makes us feel alive, and when we aren't experiencing them in a steroidal state, we feel empty, we feel numb, and we look for any and everything to give us that fix, that emotional rush. At least that's how the experiences felt for me through a majority of my life. I can't tell you how it felt or feels for you, but ask yourself this question. How do you feel when you aren't feeling emotions? I've said many times in my life that there's nothing worse than psychological abuse because it doesn't leave visible marks. But in reflecting on things, it isn't psychological abuse that we experience. It's emotional abuse that affects the psyche. There is a difference. For those that want to argue this point, ask yourself this question. In instances of relationships, in the psychological abuse that you experienced, would you have been with that person if you didn't have emotions for them? If the answer to that question is no, then it was emotional abuse. Even if it was a parent, the emotions are the underlying issue that caused the effect to the psyche, because as children, we love our parents, even when we fear them or don't like them. And that emotion is what causes the psychological trauma. Even in cases of abuse by someone you don't love or don't even know, fear is the emotion that creates the trauma. If this was a situation for you, would you have experienced the trauma if you weren't in an emotionally fearful state? Balancing emotions isn't the same as suppressing emotions, and most first cog modalities teach about suppressing negative emotions and fostering positive emotions as the cure. But I ask you this: if love is the cure, regardless of whether it is self-love or the love of others, then why isn't everyone that has been self-loving or spreading the love or soaking up the love that the New Age pipes out daily through their meditations, isn't everyone healed? Most of the people listening to this video more than likely have emotional scars and emotional baggage they want to heal themselves from. If you are one of them, and you have done all the love shit, yet still find yourself scarred and traumatized, you need to ask yourself why. I can answer the question because emotions are the cause, not the cure. In doing the internal ego deconstruction, balanced emotions is the natural outcome. Nothing is suppressed. Regardless of what happens to us or by whom, we have to take responsibility for it. This doesn't mean that the other person doesn't have responsibility, because we aren't taking responsibility for their actions or their behaviors. We are owning our responsibility for what we allowed to happen due to our inaction on our part or our inability to stop it, how we react emotionally to what happened, and how we move forward from there. The odds that the other person will take responsibility for their actions are slim to none, so holding out emotionally for them to own the responsibility for their actions is only further exacerbating the emotional trauma within the psyche and the form that you feel. By doing this, you are only emotionally nurturing the hurt. In modern therapies, whether it be psychological therapies or New Age modalities, love is portrayed to be the cure-all of everything, especially self-love. I spent many years personally trying to accomplish this self-love and found for myself that it was only a band-aid fix. All it amounts to is shifting your emotional focus from one target to another. I don't see swapping emotions and targets as a cure to the emotional and psychological trauma. I found for me that it caused more emotional and psychological trauma because when I couldn't maintain the faux emotions, I ended up emotionally tormenting myself for my failure and creating more psychological trauma in the process. Emotional neutrality did not come for me once I crossed into second cognition. I achieved it in setting aside the ego while I was still operating in first cognition. The emotions balanced on their own, and from this point of view, without emotions clouding my judgment, I was able to see my own responsibility in my trauma. I could acknowledge that it didn't serve my psyche one iota, and it gave me the strength to make the choice to let it go. No, this choice was not easy, but it was the only thing that worked to release me from the psychological hold to become a psychological cure. Now, there are two aspects of emotional trauma: the psychological aspect and the energetic programming that embeds in the cells from the abuse. One reinforces the other in a continual loop because it's driven by the emotions. Modern psychological therapies address the psychological aspect, but psychology has yet to embrace the concept of cellular programs created by the trauma. One can come to terms with their psyche over the abuse and trauma, but the energetic programming still resides in the cells and can, at any given moment, trigger the program to create the anxiety and emotional recall of the trauma. This is why modern psychological therapies do not work in the long term. Removing the cellular trauma without fixing the psychological aspect will be a temporary fix because the psyche can always reinstall the trauma with the emotions. Endel talks about using self-talk in his book Demystifying the Mystical, and we will further be elaborating on it in the second Cognition Toolbox book. One of the reasons that we do not openly share this method in great detail publicly is because it takes a lot of responsibility to use the tool for it to be the most effective, and because someone can do more damage than harm when they don't understand the process and abuse it. It's also a very personal process, and the instructions are not one size fits all. Your physical form has a consciousness independent of your psyche, and this consciousness is intelligent, but it is also very literal. And this consciousness is not the Hapim virus, it's the body-mind. This consciousness works in cooperation with your psyche, so words do not really matter when they don't align with your thoughts. There are many people that want to heal themselves from the trauma, but they also like the badge of honor that this trauma brings them. In essence, it defines them. So even when they say they want to be healed, clinging to the trauma as an identifier conflicts with the words when they say they want to let go of the trauma. In one sense, words have power, but in another sense they don't, because the meaning of the words that flow from our mouths aren't necessarily the defining thoughts within our psyche when we say those words. How many times have you said or heard others say, "I'm a rape survivor. I'm a cancer survivor. I'm an abuse survivor"? These are declarations of victimhood. This mantra may give them emotional strength, but it is further locking the trauma into the cells of the system. This trauma is an emotional event the person still embraces, even in a negative fashion. The program won't release until you can stand up and say, "I'm done with this," and mean it, and stop identifying yourself with it. I've personally been through many of the trials and tribulations that others have experienced, and although I made the claims of survivorhood in my past, I wasn't able to heal from it and be strong within myself without the labels until I let it go. Experiences are just experiences, the good, the bad, and the ugly. They are not things that define anyone unless in their mind, in their psyche, they choose to use it as a label to define themselves. Surviving isn't what gives us strength. Living is what strengthens us. When we are surviving, are we truly living? Are you really ready to heal from your trauma? Are you psychologically ready to take that shit out of the closet, pack it in a suitcase or 5, and leave them on the curb to carry out with the rest of the trash that clutters your life? Are you really ready to live a free life without victimhood and survivorhood? These are the questions you need to ask yourself. When you can find the answer without getting emotional, you'll be ready to let it go. I'm Gemma Beall. Until next time, stay the course and don't give up on yourself.